Long before Thorfinn Karlsefni crossed the sea in search of a land without war, there was another man who tried to leave war behind. His name was Thors Snorresson. To the people who knew him in Iceland, he was a quiet farmer, a dependable neighbor, a husband, and a father. He repaired boats, tended animals, carried the sick through the snow, and spoke more often with his actions than with his words. But far beyond that small settlement, among soldiers and sailors who had spent their lives measuring men by the strength of their arms, Thors was remembered by another name. They called him the Troll of Jam. That name belonged to a different life. It belonged to crowded decks slick with seawater, to shields splitting beneath axes, to the cries of men fighting for kings whose faces they might never see. It belonged to Jomsborg, the stronghold of the Jomsvikings, and to an age in which violence was treated not merely as a necessity but as proof of a man's worth. In that world, Thors had risen higher than almost anyone. He was feared, admired, and spoken of as though he were less a man than a force of nature. Yet the most important thing he ever did was not winning a battle. It was deciding that the life which had made him famous was empty. The full story of Thors is unusual because much of it is never shown directly. Vinland Saga does not give us a long account of his childhood. We are not told every place he traveled, every battle he fought, or every man he defeated. That absence matters. By the time we meet him, he has already lived through the part of his life that other Viking stories would have celebrated. The raids, the victories, the reputation, and the glory are behind him. What remains is a man looking back at all of it with regret. Even so, the fragments we are given are enough to reveal the outline of an extraordinary life. Thors was the son of a man named Snorre, which is why he carried the name Snorresson. At some point in his youth, he entered the world of the Jomsvikings. Whether he was born close to their territory or came to them after proving himself elsewhere is never explained. What is clear is that he did not remain an ordinary warrior for long. The Jomsvikings were not simply another band of raiders wandering the northern seas. They were an organized military brotherhood based at Jomsborg, a fortress near the southern coast of the Baltic. Their name inspired both respect and fear. They served powerful rulers, took part in major wars, and expected a level of discipline that separated them from looser Viking companies. Their warriors were supposed to obey their leaders, stand their ground, and place the honor of the brotherhood above individual comfort. Desertion was not a private decision, it was betrayal. Cowardice was not merely embarrassing, it was something that could stain a man's name forever. In the world of Vinland Saga, Jomsborg is almost the purest expression of the warrior society Thors would eventually reject. It is a place built around weapons, rank, bloodlines, and succession. Men gain influence because they can command others. They preserve order through fear. Children born into powerful families are treated as pieces in political struggles before they are old enough to understand what those struggles mean. For an ambitious fighter, Jomsborg offers status. For someone who begins to doubt the value of violence, it becomes a prison. Thors flourished there before he learned to hate it. He possessed the qualities that the Jomsvikings valued most. He was extraordinarily strong, fast for a man of his size, calm under pressure, and almost impossible to defeat in close combat. He understood how men moved in battle. He could judge the distance of a blade, redirect an attack, and end a fight before his opponent had fully realized that the advantage had changed hands. Later, when Askeladd's men faced him, they discovered that his reputation had not been exaggerated. Even after 15 years away from war, he could overwhelm trained killers without taking their lives. To imagine the younger Thors, then, is to imagine that same ability without the restraint. The peaceful father we know had learned to measure every movement. The Troll of Jam had once used that strength for killing. Those who remembered him did not speak of a gentle man who happened to be talented with a sword. They remembered a cold and fearsome commander. His name did not come from mercy. It came from the terrifying impression he left on people who saw him fight. The word troll in the northern imagination suggested something enormous, unnatural, and dangerous. A troll belonged to mountains, forests, darkness, and old stories. Calling Thors the Troll of Jam meant that ordinary comparisons no longer seemed sufficient. He was not simply another skilled warrior. He was the thing other warriors feared meeting when the ships came together. His reputation eventually carried him into the highest levels of the Jomsviking command. Thors became a captain, and his ability brought him close to Sigvaldi, the chief of the Jomsvikings. This was not merely a military connection. Thors married Sigvaldi's daughter Helga. Through that marriage, he became part of the ruling family of Jomsborg. Helga was also the niece of Thorkel the Tall, one of the strongest and most famous warriors of the age. The relationships around Thors therefore joined family and military power in a way that was normal for their world. A successful commander did not live apart from politics. His marriage, rank, and future were all tied to the fortress he served. Thorkel's presence in Thors' life is especially important. The two men were related through Helga, but their bond was also that of fellow warriors. Thorkel loved battle with a sincerity that few other characters in Vinland Saga could match. He did not fight because he believed war was noble in some abstract sense. He fought because it made him feel alive. Danger delighted him. Strong opponents fascinated him. The possibility of death was not something he tried to avoid. It was part of what made combat exciting. Thors, during his years as a Jomsviking, must have appeared to belong to the same world. He fought beside Thorkel and earned his respect. More remarkably, he became the one man Thorkel openly acknowledged as stronger than himself. That fact alone tells us how formidable Thors was. Thorkel was capable of lifting men as though they weighed nothing, throwing heavy weapons across impassable distances, and continuing to fight after wounds that would end the life of an ordinary soldier. Yet when he remembered Thors, there was no wounded pride in his voice. There was admiration. The contrast between them would only become clearer with time. Thorkel never lost his hunger for battle. Thors lost his completely. One man remained almost perfectly suited to the age into which he had been born. The other began to wonder whether strength might mean refusing the values of that age altogether. It is difficult to know exactly when the doubts began. People rarely abandon an identity in a single moment. Thors had spent years being rewarded for his ability to kill. Every victory would have confirmed what the world told him, that a powerful man was a valuable man, that enemies existed to be defeated, and that honor could be earned through blood. He had rank, fame, and a place among the most feared warriors in the north. Walking away meant rejecting not only his occupation, but the meaning he had once attached to his own life. The birth of his daughter Ylva became the turning point. She was born in Jomsborg while Thors was still a Jomsviking, shortly before the Battle of Eicharengavaga. The delivery was difficult for Helga. Thors, still shaped by the expectations of his society, initially hoped for a son. A son could inherit a name, become a warrior, and continue the family line in the way men of that age were taught to value. A daughter did not fit the future he had imagined. That first reaction is important because Thors was not born with the wisdom he later gave to Thorfinn. He had to change. The man who would one day insist that no one had enemies once accepted the assumptions of a warrior culture. He once looked at his own newborn child and measured her against what he thought a child should be. Helga refused to let him leave without naming the baby. Thors chose the name Ylva, the name of his own mother. It may have begun as a hurried answer, but the act created a connection. The child was no longer simply a daughter where he had expected a son. She was Ylva. She belonged to him and he belonged to her. There is something quietly powerful in the way Vinland Saga uses this change. Thors was not defeated by a greater warrior. He was disarmed by responsibility. A baby who could not lift her own head forced the troll of Jom to see life differently. The hands he had trained to break bodies now had to hold something fragile. The future was no longer an endless sequence of campaigns. It contained a child who might grow up waiting for a father who never returned. Thors began to feel the weight of what he had done. The series does not give us a list of his victims, and perhaps that is deliberate. Names would make his guilt smaller by making it countable. What troubled him was larger than a single killing. He had built his identity around the belief that violence could give life meaning. Once that belief began to fail, every victory behind him must have looked different. A warrior can survive for years by refusing to imagine the inner lives of the people he kills. The man on the opposite ship becomes an obstacle. The farmer whose food is taken becomes part of the cost of a campaign. The family waiting in a distant village remains unseen, but fatherhood made that distance harder to maintain. If Ylva's life mattered simply because she was alive, then the lives of other people's children mattered too. If Helga's fear of losing him was real, then the grief of the families he had harmed was also real. That realization did not make Thors weak. It made the old definition of strength impossible for him to accept. The Battle of Eicharengavaga gave him the chance to leave. In the year 987, the Jomsvikings fought in a great naval battle off the coast of Norway. Ships crowded the water. Men climbed across rails and shields, fighting at such close distance that the sea itself became part of the battlefield. Thors stood beside Thorkel, still wearing the identity of the warrior he had been, but his attention was divided. His thoughts returned to Helga and the newborn Ylva. Around him, the machinery of war continued as it always had. Arrows crossed the air. Men shouted warnings. Blades struck wood and iron. Thorkel noticed that Thors was distracted. For the old Thors, losing focus in battle would have been unthinkable. But the distraction was not fear, it was awakening. For the first time, perhaps, the life outside the battle felt more real than the battle itself. When an enemy knocked Thors' sword away, Thors seized the man and threw both of them into the sea. Beneath the surface they struggled. Thors took the man's weapon and killed him. It was a final act of the life he was trying to escape, intimate and brutal. Then he let the sword sink, separated himself from the battle, and swam toward land. To everyone watching from the ships, Thors Snorresson disappeared into the sea. In the confusion of battle, death required no careful proof. Men vanished beneath waves, were crushed between hulls, or sank in armor. The Jomsvikings believed that the troll of Jom had fallen. But Thors reached the shore alive. He emerged exhausted, alone, and free in a way he had never been before. Behind him were the ships, the shouting, the duty, and the name that had defined him. Ahead of him was uncertainty. Desertion from the Jomsvikings was punishable by death. His rank made the betrayal greater, not smaller. He could not simply return openly to Jomsborg and announce that he had changed his mind. Yet he also could not leave Helga and Ylva behind. That is where his decision became more than an escape from danger. Thors had already escaped the battle. He could have continued alone and made a new life under another name. Instead, he returned for his family, knowing that doing so might expose him. The man who had once fought for glory now risked everything for two people who could offer him no rank, no wealth, and no military advantage. They offered only a life he had finally learned to value. Thors made his way back to Jomsborg after the battle, no longer as a celebrated captain returning in triumph, but as a dead man moving through the shadows of his former life. The fortress that had once represented his success now stood between him and the people he loved. Every familiar wall carried danger. Every warrior who recognized him could become the one who raised the alarm. Helga had been told that her husband was dead. She had every reason to believe it. Battles swallowed men without leaving bodies behind, and the sea kept its own secrets. Then Thors returned, alive but transformed, and asked her to abandon the world she had always known. For Helga, leaving Jomsborg meant more than following a husband. She was the daughter of its chief. The fortress was her home, and the people who ruled it were her family. Her father's authority, her uncle Thorkel's reputation, and the future expected of her were all tied to that place. Thors could not promise her comfort. He could not even promise safety. He was asking her to exchange status for exile and certainty for a life spent hoping the Jomsvikings never found them. She went with him. That choice tells us a great deal about the marriage between Thors and Helga. Even though Vinland Saga presents their affection quietly, they are not a couple who constantly declare their feelings. Their trust appears in decisions. Helga understood that the man who returned from Eithringavaga was not running because he lacked courage. He had faced enough danger to know exactly what he was rejecting. She also seems to have understood, perhaps before he could fully explain it, that the change in him was real. Their escape did not go unnoticed. Thorkel found them before they could leave. To Thorkel, the situation was incomprehensible. A warrior of Thor's ability had survived a great battle and now intended to disappear. He was abandoning comrades, reputation, and the chance to fight again. In Thorkel's understanding of life, there was almost nothing more valuable than the path Thors was throwing away. Thorkel confronted him, and the two men fought. The details of that struggle are brief, but its meaning echoes across the series. Thorkel was no ordinary obstacle. He was family, a comrade, and one of the strongest warriors alive. Defeating him meant severing the final physical bond between Thors and the life of Jomsborg. It also created a memory Thorkel would carry for years. The only man stronger than him had chosen not to use that strength in the way everyone expected. Thors knocked Thorkel unconscious and escaped with Helga and Ylva. He did not kill him. That restraint is easy to overlook because Thorkel was nearly impossible to kill, but it marked the beginning of a new pattern. Thors would still use force when he believed he had no other way to protect someone. He had not become incapable of fighting. What changed was the purpose and the limit of his violence. He no longer fought to dominate, earn fame, or prove himself. He fought to create an opening through which his family could escape. From Jomsborg, the three of them traveled west and north until they reached Iceland. For people accustomed to imagining exile as a journey toward nothing, Iceland may seem an odd destination. It was cold, remote, and poor in many of the resources that made life easier elsewhere. Much of the land was difficult to farm. Winters could isolate settlements. A family survived through animals, fishing, stored food, cooperation, and careful preparation. But remoteness was exactly what Thors needed. Iceland lay far from the centers of war that had shaped his life. There were powerful landowners and old feuds there, but there were no armies constantly gathering for royal campaigns. A man could become part of a small community where usefulness mattered more than military fame. Most importantly, it was a place where the troll of Jom might disappear. Thors and Helga built a new life in a village near the sea. Their neighbors knew them as settlers, not fugitives. The name of Jomsborg faded into the background. Thors traded armor for work clothes and command for ordinary responsibility. He learned the rhythms of a place where the greatest threats were winter, hunger, illness, storms, and the occasional cruelty of powerful men. For someone who had spent years at war, peaceful life was not effortless. Peace is often described as the absence of danger, but in Vinland Saga it is something people must labor to sustain. Animals need feeding whether a man feels tired or not. Roofs collapse if no one repairs them. Boats rot, food runs short, children become sick, neighbors argue. The work does not bring songs or titles, it simply allows life to continue. Thors accepted that work. The same body that had once made him terrifying in battle made him invaluable in the village. He could row through rough water, lift heavy beams, and endure cold that exhausted other men, yet he did not use his strength to rule. The villagers respected him because he helped. He became the man people called when something was too difficult, not because he demanded that position, but because he repeatedly proved that he would come. Over the years, Ylva grew from the baby who had changed his life into a strong, practical girl. She inherited some of her father's physical power and much of her mother's clear judgment. Unlike the sons of warrior households, she was not raised to dream of fame through killing. She learned the work required to keep a family alive. She milked animals, prepared food, carried loads, and saw the world without the romantic illusions that would later seize her younger brother. Thors' relationship with Ylva is gentle but unsentimental. He does not treat her as fragile. By the time we meet the family, she is capable, outspoken, and fully woven into the labor of the household. The disappointment Thors once felt at having a daughter has vanished so completely that it survives only as evidence of how different he used to be. Years after their arrival in Iceland, Helga gave birth to a son. They named him Thorfinn. The boy entered a family already shaped by escape, though he did not know it. To him, his father was simply Thors. There were no banners in their home, no trophies from old campaigns, and no proud stories of the men his father had killed. The past was kept hidden, partly to protect the family, and partly because Thors no longer believed it deserved celebration. This silence created an irony at the heart of Thorfinn's childhood. The son of the greatest warrior in the series grew up hungry for stories of war precisely because his father refused to tell them. Thorfinn saw other boys play at battle. He heard adults speak of voyages and distant lands. He lived in a place where the sea marked both the edge of his world and the road to everything beyond it. The unknown called to him. Leif Erikson gave that unknown a name. Leif was an explorer, sailor, storyteller, and old friend of Thors. He visited the village and told the children about lands beyond Greenland, especially a warm and fertile country far to the west. He called it Vinland. In his stories there were forests, open meadows, grapes, and soil richer than the hard ground of Iceland. The children listened with the wide-eyed excitement reserved for places that exist somewhere between geography and dream. Thorfinn was fascinated. Vinland was not merely another coast. It represented a world larger than the one he knew. He asked questions, imagined ships, and stared toward the horizon as though the land might appear if he looked hard enough. Thors listened too. For Leif, Vinland was a place he had reached. For Thorfinn, it was an adventure. For Thors, it carried another meaning. A land far from war and slavery was the physical shape of the life he had been trying to create since leaving Jomsborg. Iceland had given his family refuge, but it was not beyond cruelty. Powerful men still owned slaves. Hunger still chained people to harsh choices. The old world had followed its settlers even to the edge of the North Atlantic. Vinland offered the idea of somewhere farther away. Thors never turned that idea into a plan during his lifetime. He had a family to protect and a village that depended on him. But when he spoke of Vinland, especially to the dying slave who later came into his home, He spoke with a tenderness that suggested more than polite belief in Leif's tale. The land became a promise he could offer even when he could not deliver it. Life in the village revealed Thor's philosophy through small actions long before he explained it in words. One winter, a runaway slave collapsed near the settlement. The man had escaped from Halfdan, a wealthy landowner whose authority rested on wealth, fear, and the belief that people could be bound as possessions. Halfdan was known for the chain he carried, a weapon and symbol of his view of the world. The strong created order by fastening the weak to them. The slave reached Thor's home nearly frozen to death. Thors brought him inside and tried to save him. The man's body was exhausted, and his mind drifted between the room around him and memories of the family from whom he had been separated. He spoke of his mother and sister. He imagined warmth. His escape had carried him through snow, but not far enough to create a life. When Halfdan arrived to reclaim him, the difference between the two men could not have been clearer. Halfdan saw property, Thors saw a dying person. Halfdan did not merely want the slave returned. He wanted to punish him publicly so that others would learn what happened to those who tried to escape. In Halfdan's system, cruelty had a practical function. Fear kept the chains tight even when the owner was far away. Thors offered to buy the man. He began with 3 young ewes, more than Halfdan had originally paid. Halfdan refused. Thors raised the offer. At last he agreed to give 8 ewes, all young and valuable. For an Icelandic household, 8 sheep represented food, wool, breeding stock, and security. Ylva immediately understood the cost. The slave was already dying. From the viewpoint of trade, the exchange was absurd. That was why Thors made it. He could not restore the man's health. He could not reunite him with his family. He could not undo the years of slavery. But he could ensure that the man did not die as Halfdan's property. For the final moments of his life, the chain no longer defined him. Halfdan accepted the sheep and mocked the gesture. Buying the slave did not free him from death. Thors had spent a large part of his family's wealth for someone who would never work, repay him, or even survive the day. The logic of power said Thors had lost. But Thors was acting according to a different measure of value. A life was not worthwhile only when it produced something. Freedom was not meaningless because it lasted a short time. Mercy did not become foolish simply because it failed to create a happy ending. As the slave faded, Thors told him about Vinland. Far across the sea, he said, there was a warm and fertile land beyond the reach of war and slave traders. He invited the man, in the language of a dream, to go there and live in peace. It was not a literal rescue. It was the only refuge Thors could offer to someone whose body could no longer travel. After the man died, the family buried him beneath the northern sky. Ylva mourned the lost sheep with the blunt honesty of someone who understood how difficult the coming months might become. Thorfinn asked questions. He had heard from Leif that their own ancestors had once fled to Iceland to escape a powerful ruler. Now he had watched another man run from bondage and die before reaching safety. Where Thorfinn wondered, could someone flee if even Iceland was not far enough? The question remained between father and son. Thors did not have a complete answer. Vinland existed somewhere across the sea, but reaching a land did not automatically free the people who arrived there from the violence they carried inside themselves. Thors understood the first half of that truth. His son would spend the rest of the story learning the second. The incident with the slave also showed that Thor's peaceful life was not passive withdrawal. He had not left Jomsborg merely because he disliked being personally involved in battle. He had developed a deep opposition to the systems built by violence. When Halfdan entered his home with armed men, Thors did not challenge him to a fight. He used negotiation and sacrifice. He paid a painful price rather than reach for the strength that could have killed Halfdan. This restraint was not fear of losing. Thors could almost certainly have defeated Halfdan and many of his followers. The problem was what would happen afterward. Killing a powerful landowner would create revenge, division, and danger for the entire village. Violence might solve the immediate confrontation while multiplying the suffering around it. Thors had learned to look beyond the next blow. That was one of the greatest differences between him and the boy growing up at his side. Thorfinn saw only the moment. He saw a sword and imagined power. He saw warriors and imagined adventure. He did not yet see widows, hungry children, burned farms, and the years of hatred that followed a victorious raid. Thors had seen all of those things. The tragedy of their relationship was that he would not live long enough to teach his son slowly. The past returned to Iceland on a warship. 15 years had passed since the Battle of Eicharangavaga. For most of that time, Thors had succeeded in becoming exactly what he wanted to be, a man whose children knew nothing of the Troll of Jom. Then a long vessel entered the harbor carrying armed Jomsvikings under the command of Floki. The arrival changed the atmosphere of the village immediately. A warship was not an ordinary visitor. Its carved hull, shields, weapons, and disciplined crew announced that the struggles of distant kingdoms had crossed the sea and reached people who had done nothing to invite them. The children stared in fascination. The adults understood enough to be afraid. Floki had known Thors during his years with the Jomsvikings. He was a commander himself, but the two men were never equals in reputation. Thors' ability had placed him above Floki in the eyes of many warriors, and Floki carried a deep resentment that time had not erased. He interpreted Thors' quietness as contempt. Where other men saw the Troll of Jom as a legend, Floki saw someone whose existence diminished him. He came with an official message. King Sweyn of Denmark was preparing a new invasion of England. The killing of Danes living under English rule had given the king both motive and opportunity for war. Chief Sigvaldi had ordered the Jomsviking forces to gather at Jomsborg. Every captain was expected to return. That included Thors. Thors answered that the affairs of great kingdoms had nothing to do with a small village in Iceland. It was a simple statement, but it rejected the entire logic of men like Floki. Kings declared wars, and ordinary people were expected to accept that their bodies belonged to the cause. A command issued across the sea was supposed to outweigh the needs of families who would lose fathers and sons. Floki reminded him that desertion had not erased his obligations. The chief was offering Thors a chance to return with honor. The message was presented as mercy, but the warship in the harbor made the threat unmistakable. If Thors refused, the Jomsvikings could punish the village. They could take hostages, burn homes, or kill people who did not even understand why they had become enemies. Thors looked at the soldiers, the frightened adults, and the boys listening from nearby. He knew the kind of men standing before him because he had once been one of them. A direct refusal would not end the matter. It would simply transfer the cost of his freedom onto his neighbors. So he agreed to go. The decision was not a return to the warrior life. It was an attempt to protect the village from it. Thors understood that the command had been designed to leave him no clean choice. If he stayed, others suffered. If he left, he placed himself back within reach of the organization he had betrayed. He chose the path that concentrated the danger on himself. Floki then invited the young men of the village to join the expedition. To him, their eagerness was useful. To the boys, it sounded like the beginning of a heroic story. They had grown up hearing fragments of distant warfare without ever seeing the consequences. They practiced with sticks, boasted about courage, and imagined that the battlefield would reveal who they truly were. Ari was among the most excited. He was old enough to think of himself as a man and young enough to believe that killing one would prove it. The other boys compared strength and argued over who deserved to go. Thorfinn, only 6 years old, was consumed by a different discovery. The armored strangers had crossed the sea specifically for his father. The quiet man who worked beside him had once been important enough for the Jomsvikings to remember after 15 years. For a child already fascinated by adventure, the revelation was irresistible. Thorfinn began searching the house for a weapon. He found an old chest containing equipment from Thor's previous life. The objects inside were more than metal and leather. They were the sealed remains of an identity Thors had tried to bury. Thorfinn pulled out a short sword and held it with excitement, imagining himself transformed by the weapon. Thors found him. He did not shout immediately. He took the sword and asked his son a question. Who did he intend to kill with it? Thorfinn had no answer. The weapon had seemed complete in itself. He had imagined possession, not consequence. To a child, a sword could be a symbol of adulthood, bravery, and freedom. Thors forced him to confront its purpose. A sword was made to open human bodies. To want one without knowing whom you intended to hurt was to desire violence in the abstract before any enemy even existed. Thors told him that he had no enemies. No one did. There was no person in the world whom he needed to hurt. The statement confused Thorfinn because it contradicted nearly everything the culture around him suggested. Stories required enemies. Warriors gained honor by defeating them. Families remembered old insults. Kings divided the world into allies and opponents. Even children organized their games around the idea that one side must destroy the other. Thors was trying to give his son, in a few sentences, the understanding it had taken him years of killing to reach. He did not mean that no one would ever attack Thorfinn. Thors himself was preparing to leave because armed men had threatened his home. He did not mean that cruel people did not exist, or that danger could always be avoided through gentle words. His own life disproved any simple version of that belief. What he meant was that an enemy is not a natural category of human being. It is a role we assign. A person may threaten us, harm us, or stand across a battlefield from us, but none of that makes hatred a duty. The moment we decide that another life has no value, violence becomes easy to justify. Thors wanted Thorfinn to resist that transformation. The boy was too young to understand. He saw his father take the sword away and felt only frustration. Years later, those words would return to him after he had spent much of his youth doing the exact opposite of what Thors asked. Preparations for the voyage continued. The village supplied a ship and a small group of enthusiastic young men. Thors intended to prevent them from reaching the war. Leif planned to travel with the expedition and later carry the boys back to Iceland. His smaller vessel could take 5 of them. The arrangement revealed how carefully Thors tried to protect people without humiliating them. The boys could leave believing they were warriors, but he meant to turn them home before they ever saw England. Helga understood the danger more clearly than anyone. The Jomsvikings had found them. Even if Thors obeyed, there was no guarantee they would forgive the desertion. She had already watched him leave for battle once, when Ylva was a baby, and had believed him dead. Now she faced the same possibility with far less innocence. Their farewell was restrained. Thors did not promise what he could not know. Helga did not try to stop him when she understood why he had agreed. The silence between them carried 15 years of shared life. The escape, the winters, the children, the work, and the fragile peace they had built at the edge of the world. Ylva, practical as always, worried about what his absence would mean for the farm. Thorfinn burned with determination to join the voyage. The difference between the 2 children showed how unevenly the truth of their father's life had reached them. Ylva knew the value of the man who repaired, carried, provided, and returned home each night. Thorfinn had just discovered the legend and wanted to chase it. Before the ship departed, Thors searched for his son who seemed to have disappeared. He could not find him in the village. He had no choice but to leave, believing Thorfinn remained safely behind. The ships moved away from Iceland. The familiar coastline narrowed. The houses, people, and fields became small shapes against the land. For the young men on board, it was exhilarating. They had crossed the boundary between ordinary life and the adventure they had imagined. Then Thorfinn emerged from the cargo hold. He had hidden on the ship rather than allow his father to leave without him. His face carried pride in the success of the plan. Thor's reaction was not anger alone, it was fear. The entire purpose of his sacrifice had been to keep the danger away from his family, and now his 6-year-old son stood at the center of it. He could not turn back without risking the village and exposing his intentions to any observers. He could not send Thorfinn home alone. The boy's presence transformed a dangerous journey into a nearly impossible one. Thors now had to protect the young volunteers, satisfy the Jomsvikings long enough to keep Iceland safe, and keep his own child alive. While Thors sailed, Floki traveled to the Faroe Islands and met a mercenary leader named Askeladd. Askeladd commanded a band of roughly 100 men. They were Vikings in the practical sense of the word, raiders, fighters, and opportunists who sold their ability to whoever offered the right reward. Unlike men who wrapped violence in talk of honor, Askeladd rarely confused killing with nobility. He understood greed, fear, pride, and weakness. His men followed him because he was clever enough to keep them alive and profitable. Floki did not tell him the whole truth. He presented Thors as a deserter who needed to be removed before reaching Jomsborg. He offered payment for an assassination. The decision exposed the personal hatred beneath the official order. If Sigvaldi truly wanted Thors returned, killing him served no military purpose. Floki wanted the man gone before his old reputation could be restored. He was also afraid to face Thors directly. Floki had arrived in Iceland with trained Jomsvikings and a warship. He could have attempted to arrest or kill the deserter there. Instead, he relied on threats to make Thors leave, then hired outsiders to ambush him far from witnesses. The plan was designed to preserve Floki's position. Thors would die at the hands of mercenaries, and the story could be adjusted afterward. Askeladd listened with interest. He had heard the name Troll of Jarm. A man whose former comrades would pay to have him murdered was likely dangerous, but danger increased the price. Askeladd accepted the task and began planning an ambush. The contrast between Thors and Askeladd is central to what followed. Both men understood violence deeply. Both could read opponents and manipulate the rhythm of a fight. Both were more intelligent than the warriors around them often realized, but they had responded to the world in opposite ways. Thors had seen that violence corrupted everything it touched and tried to step outside it. Askeladd saw the same corruption and decided to master it. He trusted no grand ideals. He used men's greed before they could use his. He survived by remaining a step ahead of people who believed themselves stronger. When Floki asked Askeladd to kill Thors, he unknowingly arranged a meeting between two men who had reached different answers to the same brutal age. At sea, Thor's small expedition continued south. The young villagers trained, talked, and imagined the battles ahead. Thorfinn watched his father with new attention. Every ordinary movement seemed to conceal evidence of the legendary warrior he had only just discovered. Thors, meanwhile, tried to preserve the ordinary man he had become. He did not boast. He did not encourage the boys' excitement. He looked at the sea and understood that each mile carried them closer to the past he had escaped. A storm and changing conditions pushed the ships toward the Faroe Islands. The islands rose from the sea as steep walls of dark rock, cut by narrow channels. In such waters, geography could become a weapon. A larger force could hide above a passage and trap a ship where it had little room to maneuver. Askeladd knew this. His men prepared the ambush in a narrow channel. Archers took positions high on the cliffs. The route ahead appeared empty, but the silence was constructed. By the time Thor's ship entered, retreat would be difficult and enemies would command the heights. Leif sensed danger. Thors did too. The cheerful illusion of the voyage ended as armed men appeared above them. Stones and debris blocked movement. Archers drew their bows. Askeladd's warriors revealed themselves, and the small group from Iceland finally saw what war looked like when it was not a story told beside a fire. They had imagined standing in formation against visible enemies. Instead, they were trapped. They had imagined courage would make them powerful. Instead, their lives depended entirely on the quiet man they had followed from home. Thors looked at the cliffs, the ships, the archers, and the frightened faces around him. The Troll of Jarm had returned to a battlefield, but the man standing there was no longer the warrior who had vanished into the sea 15 years earlier. This time, he would fight without allowing himself to become that man again. Askeladd's men expected the trap itself to win the battle. They had the higher ground, more fighters, and control of the narrow waterway. The Icelanders stood packed together on a small ship with nowhere to run. A volley of arrows could end the confrontation before any sword was drawn. Thors understood that a normal battle would be a massacre. The boys from his village had enthusiasm but no experience. They did not know how to keep formation under attack, how to read the movement of archers, or how quickly confidence disappeared when the first man fell. If he allowed both groups to begin fighting at once, he would lose control of the situation. So he moved first. He crossed to the enemy vessel alone. The action was so direct that it disrupted the rhythm of the ambush. Askeladd's men had prepared to rain death downward on frightened prey. They had not expected the prey to place himself among them. Thors landed on the deck without drawing a sword. Men rushed him from several directions. He met them with his hands, elbows, shoulders, and feet. Each movement was precise. He struck jaws, ribs, arms, and stomachs. He threw attackers into one another. He used their momentum rather than wasting strength. The result looked effortless, but that ease came from years of experience sharpened by 15 years of restraint. The younger Thors had learned how to create openings for killing blows. The older Thors used the same knowledge to avoid them. He knew exactly how much force could stop a man without ending his life. He broke bones, knocked people unconscious, and left bodies scattered across the deck, but he did not kill. That distinction made the fight more difficult, not less. A swordsman who intends to kill can strike the nearest vulnerable point. A man determined to preserve life must make decisions within every fraction of a second. He must protect himself, protect the people behind him, and protect the attacker from the consequences of the attacker's own violence. One of Askeladd's men fell into the water. Thors could have ignored him. The man had joined an ambush and moments earlier would gladly have killed the Icelanders. Instead, Thors threw him an oar so he would not drown. That small act contained the whole of Thor's philosophy. The man was still dangerous. Saving him offered no advantage. No one would have blamed Thors for letting the sea take him, but Thors refused to decide that an enemy's life no longer mattered. From a distance, Askeladd watched with growing interest. He had expected strength. He had not expected control. Many powerful fighters became predictable because they trusted force to solve every problem. Thors was different. He remained calm, observed everything, and never allowed the excitement of combat to take command of him. Askeladd's men, by contrast, began to panic. Their numbers had seemed overwhelming until one unarmed man moved through them. They swung harder, shouted louder, and interfered with one another. Fear made them careless. Thors used that carelessness without sharing it. Bjorn, Askeladd's closest companion, reacted differently. He was a warrior who enjoyed fighting and relied on a berserker mushroom to drive himself into a state of violent rage. The mushroom dulled pain, stripped away caution, and turned strength into something wild. When Bjorn consumed it, he became dangerous to enemies and allies alike. As the rage overtook him, he struck men from his own crew, threw bodies aside, and damaged the deck. The other mercenaries fled from his path. Bjorn's power increased, but his awareness narrowed until only destruction remained. The contrast with Thors could not have been sharper. Both men were physically imposing. Both could overwhelm ordinary fighters, but Bjorn surrendered his judgment in order to become more violent, while Thor's greatest power was complete command of himself. Bjorn charged. Thors recognized the mushroom's effect immediately. He had lived among men who used rage as a weapon. He knew that pain alone might not stop Bjorn. The first strike landed with enough force to stagger him, but the berserker came again. Thors answered with an uppercut that lifted the larger man and sent him crashing down. Even then, Bjorn tried to rise. His body had reached its limit before his fury admitted it. Thors struck him once more and ended the attack without ending his life. The deck grew still. Dozens of armed men had been defeated. The villagers stared at Thors as though seeing him for the first time. The father who had repaired their boats and carried their supplies now stood among fallen mercenaries, and the old name suddenly made sense. This was the Troll of Jam. Yet the name was also wrong. The warrior who had earned it would have left corpses behind. The man before them had demonstrated a greater mastery than his legend described. Thors called for Askeladd. He understood that defeating one group of men would not solve the larger problem. Archers still watched from the cliffs. More mercenaries remained. The Icelanders were still trapped. The only way to reduce the conflict to something he could control was to challenge the leader directly. A duel offered Askeladd something valuable, the chance to preserve authority. If he refused after watching his men lose, they might see cowardice. If he accepted and won, the conflict would end with his reputation strengthened. Thors used the pride of the warrior culture against itself. Askeladd came forward. Before the duel, the two men spoke. Their words were careful because each was trying to understand the other. Askeladd saw that Thors did not behave like a normal deserter. He carried himself like a commander but rejected command. He possessed the skill to take power but showed no desire for it. To Askeladd, who had spent his life reading hidden motives, a man without an obvious selfish goal was difficult to measure. Thors asked whether Askeladd was the leader and offered terms. If Thors won, Askeladd would allow the ships and villagers to leave. Askeladd agreed according to the customs of the duel, swearing by the honor his men expected him to possess. The fight began with swords. Askeladd was not merely clever. He was one of the finest fighters of his generation. His style depended on speed, observation, and deception. He watched an opponent's habits, invited certain attacks, and searched for the moment when confidence created carelessness. Against most men, he could control a fight by allowing them to believe they were controlling it. Thors gave him very little to use. Their blades struck with force that damaged the weapons. Thors' strength pressed Askeladd backward, but Askeladd avoided meeting that strength directly whenever possible. He changed angles, tested Thor's reactions, and used the ship itself as part of the battle. At one point, part of the rigging and sail came down, creating confusion. Askeladd used the obstruction to hide an attack. It was the kind of trick that had killed better men than the ones in his crew. Thors evaded it and countered so quickly that Askeladd barely escaped the full force of the blow. For perhaps the first time in years, Askeladd faced someone who saw through him as quickly as he saw through others. The mercenaries cheered for their leader, insisting that no man alive could match him. Askeladd did not share their confidence. He understood that Thors was guiding the duel. Even the damage to the swords became part of that control. Askeladd noticed that Thors' blade had grown brittle from repeated impacts. He allowed Thors to strike his breastplate, expecting the weapon to break. It did. The sword snapped near the hilt, leaving Thors apparently unarmed. Askeladd committed to the killing blow. That was the opening Thors had prepared. Instead of retreating, Thors struck Askeladd's sword arm near the elbow. The blow disrupted his grip. Askeladd's weapon fell and Thors caught it before it reached the deck. In a single sequence, the unarmed man took possession of his opponent's sword and placed the blade at Askeladd's neck. The duel was over. Askeladd realized that his decisions had been anticipated from the beginning. Thors had allowed his own sword to break because he knew Askeladd would attack decisively. He had not merely reacted faster. He had led one of the most calculating fighters in the series toward a conclusion chosen in advance. Askeladd told him to finish it. In the warrior code surrounding them, victory in such a duel ended with death. A defeated leader who survived could be humiliated. Killing Askeladd would also remove the most dangerous mind among the mercenaries. From a purely practical view, Thors had every reason to press the blade forward. He did not. Thors declared that he had won and ordered Askeladd to honor the agreement. The mercenaries were stunned. The villagers celebrated. For a brief moment, it appeared that Thors had accomplished the impossible. He had defeated an entire group without killing, overcome their leader, and created a path home. Askeladd studied him. He asked why a man of such ability had hidden in Iceland for 15 years. To Askeladd, talent was a resource. A warrior who could command armies, earn wealth, and shape kingdoms had chosen instead to live among sheep and fishermen. It looked like waste. Thors answered that he did not consider those years wasted. That reply may be the clearest statement of what he valued. The world would measure his life by the period in which he was the troll of Jam. Songs would remember battles more easily than winters spent raising children. Askeladd saw 15 years without fame. Thor saw Ylva growing up, Thorfinn being born, Helga beside him, neighbors helped, animals tended, and days in which no one died by his hand. Askeladd then heard the idea that separated Thors from every warrior he knew. Thors admitted that he still depended on a sword because he was imperfect. A true warrior, he said, needed no sword. To the men listening, the statement seemed impossible. A warrior was defined by his ability to fight. Remove the weapon and what remained. Thors was using the word warrior in a new way. A true warrior was not someone who could kill every enemy. It was someone strong enough to refuse the need for enemies. The sword was evidence of failure, a tool used when wisdom, courage, and compassion had not found another path. He did not claim to have reached that ideal. That humility matters. Thors had just defeated Askeladd and dozens of men, yet he called himself imperfect. He knew that the fight, however restrained, was not the peaceful solution he wished existed. He had protected lives, but he had still needed force. Askeladd was fascinated. Half as a challenge and half as a genuine impulse, he asked whether Thors would become the leader of his band. For a moment, Askeladd imagined what a man like this might do with command. Perhaps he sensed a form of greatness that had nothing to do with kings. Thors remained silent. He had not escaped one warrior brotherhood to take charge of another. Askeladd laughed the offer away as a joke, but the question had been real enough to expose his respect. Then Bjorn climbed onto the Icelander's ship and seized Thorfinn. The entire balance changed. Bjorn held the child where Thors could see him. The duel's terms, the promises, and the idea of honor became meaningless. Askeladd pointed out the truth Thors already knew. Mercenaries who lived by deception would not surrender their advantage because of a ritual. Thor's anger surfaced. For an instant, the force of the old troll of Jarm seemed close enough to frighten everyone around him. He had defeated the men before him. He could still attack, but no movement was fast enough to guarantee Thorfinn's safety. The boy was in the hands of someone willing to kill him. Askeladd stated what he wanted: Thor's life. Thors understood. He threw away the sword. The decision was immediate because, for Thors, there was never a real choice. He could preserve his life by gambling with his sons, or he could surrender the one thing Askeladd had been hired to take. Every lesson he had learned since Ylva's birth pointed toward the same answer. Askeladd gave the signal. Archers released their arrows from the cliffs. The shafts crossed the narrow space and struck Thors from several directions. One impact would have dropped many men. Thors remained standing as more arrows entered his body. The strength that had made him famous could not protect him from a command he had chosen not to resist. Thorfinn screamed. For the boy, the scene was incomprehensible. Moments earlier, his father had defeated everyone. He had proven stronger than the mercenaries, stronger than their berserker, and more skilled than their leader. In the simple logic of a child, the strongest person was supposed to win. Yet Thors had thrown away the sword and allowed himself to be killed. The difference between defeat and sacrifice was too large for Thorfinn to understand. Thors did not spend his final moments cursing Askeladd. He focused on the living. He reminded Askeladd of the agreement and demanded that the villagers be allowed to leave. Even after being betrayed, he continued to use the terms of the duel because they were the only protection he could still give. Askeladd agreed. There was calculation in that promise, but also respect. He had completed Floki's assignment. Killing the inexperienced Icelanders offered little profit and might weaken the strange authority Thor's death had created over the moment. More importantly, Askeladd had been affected by the man he was sent to murder. He did not become merciful, but he recognized that he had met someone unlike anyone else. Thors looked toward his son. He had tried to teach Thorfinn that no one had enemies. He had tried to keep the sword from his hands. Now the child watched an enemy kill his father. The circumstances seemed to disprove every word Thors had spoken. There was no time left to explain. Thors died standing among the men he had defeated without killing. The stillness afterward carried more weight than the battle. Askeladd's warriors had expected the satisfaction of victory, but there was little triumph in it. They had not overcome Thors in combat. They had forced a father to exchange himself for a child. The body before them was evidence not of their strength, but of his choice. The Icelanders gathered around him. Ari, who had dreamed of war, was broken by what he saw. His first encounter with real violence had revealed that courage and strength did not protect good people from treachery. The adventure he imagined had ended before reaching England. Thorfinn's grief became rage almost instantly. Rage was easier to hold than helplessness. If Askeladd was an enemy, then the world became simple again. His father had been killed, so he would kill the killer. He took the short blade associated with Thors and turned it toward revenge. This was the beginning of the tragedy Thors had tried to prevent. Askeladd allowed the Icelanders to leave, but their ship could not be sailed home without Thors. The mercenaries took what they wanted and left the survivors to return with Leif. Thorfinn, however, hid aboard Askeladd's vessel. Just as he had stowed away to follow his father from Iceland, he now stowed away to follow the man who killed him. The first act had been childish adventure. The second was the birth of an obsession. Leif returned to Iceland without Thors and without Thorfinn. He carried the news to Helga and Ylva. No long scene is needed to understand what that return meant. Helga had once been told that Thors died in battle and later discovered that he had survived. This time there would be no unexpected figure at the door. The peaceful life they built had ended with the same world they fled, reaching across the sea to take him. Ylva responded in her own way. She worked. Grief did not feed animals or repair buildings. With her father gone and her brother missing, much of the burden of the household fell onto her. The strong daughter Thors had once failed to appreciate became the person who preserved the family he left behind. Helga waited for Thorfinn. Her faith that he remained alive survived year after year, even as no reliable news came home. Leif accepted the responsibility of searching for him. In this way, Thor's relationships continued to shape the people around him after his death. The family did not dissolve, though it was wounded. The bonds he had built in 15 quiet years proved more durable than the fame he earned as a warrior. Thorfinn's life moved in the opposite direction. He followed Askeladd's band through war, raids, hunger, and bloodshed. He demanded duels, believing that killing Askeladd honorably would restore meaning to his father's death. Askeladd used that desire. He promised opportunities to fight in exchange for dangerous work, turning the boy's hatred into a tool. Thorfinn became what Thors feared, a child shaped by the battlefield. He learned to move with extraordinary speed, attack larger men, survive alone, and kill without hesitation. The talent of the father appeared in the son, stripped of the wisdom the father had died trying to teach. The dagger in Thorfinn's hand became a dark answer to the sword Thors had taken away in Iceland. Thors had asked whom he intended to kill. After the ambush, Thorfinn always had an answer: Askeladd. Yet revenge never brought him closer to his father. Each duel ended in defeat because Thorfinn fought from anger, and Askeladd understood how to control angry men. Thorfinn believed he was honoring Thors by pursuing a fair victory. In reality, he was organizing his entire life around the enemy Thors told him he did not have. Askeladd became both murderer and reluctant teacher. He mocked Thorfinn's lack of control, sent him into danger, and watched him grow into a fearsome fighter. But the memory of Thors remained between them. Askeladd knew what the boy could not yet accept. Even if Thorfinn killed him, he would not become a true warrior. Thorkel also carried Thor's memory. When he met the older Thorfinn years later, he immediately recognized traces of his father. Thorkel spoke of the troll of Jom with admiration and recalled the strength of the man who had defeated him. But what confused Thorkel most was not Thor's power, it was his decision to leave. Thorkel wanted to know what Thors had discovered. He had spent his life seeking the highest experience of battle, yet somewhere beneath his joy was the suspicion that Thors had found something greater. When Thors spoke of a true warrior, he had pointed toward a kind of strength Thorkel could sense but not understand. Askeladd carried the same question in a different form. He had seen Thors refuse power, spare enemies, and die for others. Askeladd's own life was built around secret loyalties and ruthless sacrifices. He despised much of the Viking world, especially the Danish arrogance that had destroyed his mother's life, but he continued to use its methods. Thors showed him a man who had rejected those methods without becoming helpless. Near the end of Askeladd's life, that example mattered. When he sacrificed himself to protect Wales and create a path for Canute, his final act echoed Thor's choice. The circumstances were different. Askeladd killed King Sweyn and forced Canute to strike him down. It was a political performance, violent and calculated, but at its center was a man accepting death so that others might live. In his final moments, Askeladd turned to Thorfinn and told him to move beyond the narrow world of revenge. He asked how long he intended to remain trapped and urged him to become a true warrior. Those words belonged to the lesson Askeladd first heard from Thors. Thorfinn could not receive them then. Askeladd's death took away the purpose around which he had built his life. The enemy vanished before revenge could be completed. With no one left to kill, Thorfinn discovered that hatred had given him direction but not identity. He was enslaved and sent to work on Ketil's farm. There, far from the battlefield, Thor's influence slowly returned. Thorfinn dreamed of the dead. He saw the people he had killed reaching for him from below. The weight Thors had learned to feel after Ylva's birth now descended upon the son. For the first time, Thorfinn could no longer hide the human cost of his life behind the name of an enemy. Einar helped him awaken. Einar was a farmer whose family had been destroyed by raiders like the ones Thorfinn once served. Their friendship forced Thorfinn to see himself from the side of the people beneath the sword. The raids that had seemed like assignments were other people's endings. When Thorfinn finally chose to reject violence, he remembered his father. The words spoken in Iceland and at the ambush, buried beneath years of rage, became meaningful. No one was his enemy. A true warrior needed no sword. Thor's teaching had failed to guide the child, because the child lacked the life needed to understand it. It reached the adult only after suffering had translated the words. Thorfinn made a vow he would never hurt another person again. He would seek ways to resolve conflict without violence. If one method failed, he would search for another. Violence would be the final option, and he would try to create a life in which even that option could be left behind. The vow was more absolute than Thor's own practice. Thors admitted that he still needed a sword because he was imperfect. Thorfinn tried to carry the idea farther, to live without one even in a world that would repeatedly punish him for it. This was not simple imitation. Thorfinn did not become his father. He developed his own path from the fragments Thors left behind. When he decided to build a land free from war and slavery, he turned toward Vinland. The place Leif described beside the fire, and the place Thors described to a dying slave, became a real destination. Thorfinn no longer wanted to travel there for adventure. He wanted to create the refuge his father had been unable to reach. In that sense, Thor's promise to the slave survived. It passed through Thorfinn and Einar into the plan for a settlement where people fleeing violence might begin again. When Thorfinn eventually returned to Iceland as a young man, the homecoming completed a journey that began with Thor's departure years earlier. The boy who had hidden in the ship was gone. In his place stood someone marked by war, slavery, guilt, and a determination to live differently. Helga recognized him despite the years. A mother does not need a warrior's proof. Beneath the scars and unfamiliar face, she saw the child she had continued to believe would come home. She also saw something of Thor's in him, not merely in his features, but in the change he had undergone. Ylva's reaction was louder. She had spent years carrying responsibilities while her brother vanished into the world. To her, his return did not erase the pain of his absence. She struck him, scolded him, and then accepted him back into the family in the practical way she approached everything. The scene showed that Thor's household had survived without becoming a monument to him. Life had continued. Children had grown. Work had been done. Grief had become part of the family rather than the end of it. Thorfinn explained his plan to seek Vinland and build a settlement without war or slavery. Helga listened to the idea her husband had once described. The dream had traveled in a circle. Leif first gave Vinland to Thorfinn as a child's wonder. Thors turned it into a promise of refuge. Now Thorfinn returned with the intention of making that promise physical. The plan required more than good intentions. Ships, supplies, livestock, tools, and settlers all cost wealth. Thorfinn traveled east to raise the resources, and the journey brought him back into contact with the world of warriors. Each encounter tested whether Thor's teaching could survive outside the safety of a farm. One of the most difficult tests came through Hild, a hunter whose father Thorfinn had killed during his years with Askeladd's band. To her, Thorfinn was not a misunderstood young man seeking redemption. He was the person who had destroyed her family. She had every reason to name him as an enemy. Thorfinn did not deny what he had done. He could not restore her father or ask her to forget. Instead, he placed his life within reach of her judgment and promised to prove through his actions that he had changed. Hild traveled with the group, watching him closely and prepared to kill him if he returned to violence. This relationship carried Thor's philosophy beyond easy words. Saying no one is an enemy is simple when speaking about a stranger. It is much harder when facing the person who murdered someone you loved. Hild's anger was not childish pride. It was rooted in real loss. Thorfinn's pacifism could not require her to pretend the loss did not matter. Over time, she saw him protect others, reject opportunities for revenge, and accept suffering rather than pass it onward. Her eventual forgiveness did not erase his crime. It recognized the long work of becoming someone different. In that moment, Thorfinn received something Thors never lived long enough to seek: forgiveness from a person harmed by the violent life he had once led. The journey also led Thorfinn back toward Jomsborg. His connection to Thors made him important in a struggle over the leadership of the Jomsvikings. The son of the troll of Jom carried a name that warriors could rally around even though he wanted nothing from their organization. Floki remained at the center of that struggle. Years earlier, his resentment had led him to hire Askeladd. Now Thorfinn learned the truth. The man responsible for arranging Thor's death stood within reach. This was the revenge Thorfinn had once believed he wanted. Askeladd had carried out the killing, but Floki had created the trap. A younger Thorfinn would have attacked without hesitation. The adult Thorfinn felt the rage rise and came dangerously close to losing control. He injured Floki and destroyed his sword, but he stopped short of killing him. The restraint was not clean or effortless. That is what made it meaningful. Thorfinn did not discover that he had become too peaceful to feel hatred. He felt it. He understood exactly whom he could blame. Then he refused to let the feeling choose his future. By sparing Floki, he ended the chain at the point where it could have continued into another generation. Killing Floki would not bring Thors back. It would create new grief for Floki's grandson Balder and give others a reason to pursue Thorfinn. The pattern was the same one Thors had recognized when facing Halfdan in Iceland. Violence promises closure while quietly opening the next wound. Through the strange politics of Jomsborg, Thorfinn was temporarily placed in a position of authority over the very organization his father deserted. The son returned to the fortress the father had risked everything to escape, yet Thorfinn did not seize the chance to restore the family's status. He used the authority to disband the Jomsvikings. It was perhaps the most complete victory Thors ever achieved, though it happened years after his death. The brotherhood that had threatened his village, forced him to sea, and treated war as a permanent purpose ceased to exist by the decision of his son. Thorfinn did not conquer it and replace its chief. He removed the structure itself. Men who had been organized around killing were released from the identity that told them violence was the only life available. Thorkel accepted the decision with reluctance and confusion. He loved the Jomsvikings and the battles they provided, but he also loved Thors, and he sensed that Thorfinn might carry the answer to the question his old comrade left behind: what was a true warrior? Thorkel still tried to draw Thorfinn into combat. Fighting was the language he understood best, but his curiosity about Thors softened the distance between them. Thors had become a mystery that even decades of battle could not solve. Why would the strongest man leave? Why would he call a life without war more valuable than glory? Thorfinn's existence was the only answer Thorkel could observe. After the Jomsvikings were dissolved and the eastern journey completed, Thorfinn returned again to Iceland with the resources needed for Vinland. He gathered people willing to cross the sea. Some sought land, some sought opportunity, some wanted escape. Their motives were as varied as the people themselves. Thorfinn established one central rule: the settlement would not bring swords. The rule was a direct extension of Thor's belief that a true warrior needed no weapon. It was also a practical gamble. Thorfinn knew that weapons created fear. Settlers who arrived armed would appear as invaders to the people already living in Vinland. A sword carried for protection could become the reason protection was needed. Not everyone agreed. Some believed peace required visible strength. Others hid weapons, convinced that Thorfinn's idealism would place everyone at risk. The disagreement showed the problem Thors never had time to solve. One man can throw away his sword. A community must decide whether it trusts every frightened member to do the same. Vinland was beautiful, fertile, and real, but it was not empty. Indigenous people already lived there. Thorfinn tried to approach them through trade, patience, and respect. For a time, the settlement suggested that the dream might succeed. Crops grew, families built homes. People who had known slavery and war experienced ordinary days in a new land. In those quiet moments, Thor's life in Iceland found a larger echo. Peace again appeared not as a dramatic achievement, but as work. Trees were cleared, houses raised, food shared, misunderstandings translated, and trust built slowly. The dream depended on countless actions no saga writer would normally call heroic. Yet fear entered the settlement. Differences in language, illness, resources, and expectation created tension. Weapons that had been hidden became symbols of distrust. Men argued that Thorfinn's refusal to fight would lead to disaster. Among the indigenous people, some also came to believe that the newcomers would eventually bring destruction. The conflict revealed the limit of any philosophy when applied by imperfect people. Thorfinn could choose not to hate, but he could not make everyone else release fear at the same speed. He could offer peace, but he could not control how every action would be interpreted. Disease could spread without intention. A frightened person could turn a tool into a weapon in a moment. Thors had never promised that peace would be easy. His own life proved the opposite. He died while trying to protect peace from men who used love against him. What he offered was not a guarantee of survival, it was a direction. When violence came to Vinland, Thorfinn faced the deepest test of his father's legacy. If the settlement fought to remain, it might become the kind of colony he never wanted. If it withdrew, years of labor would be lost. People who trusted him would feel betrayed. The decision to leave did not mean the dream had been foolish. It meant that preserving life mattered more than preserving possession. Thors had once abandoned rank, home, and reputation rather than remain inside the machinery of war. Thorfinn, following the same logic, accepted that a peaceful land could not be created by forcing others to surrender it. The settlement struggle did not produce the perfect refuge Thors imagined for the dying slave, but the attempt changed the people involved. Seeds, ideas, relationships, and memories remained. A failed peace is not identical to no peace at all. Every day in which people lived without chains or raids had value, just as Thors believed 15 quiet years in Iceland were not wasted because they ended violently. That may be the most important way Thor's story reaches beyond his death. Success is not measured only by whether violence disappears forever. It is measured by whether a person refuses to let violence become the only possible future. Every important person who knew Thors remembered a different man. To Helga, he was not primarily the troll of Jarm. She had known that warrior, but she also knew the uncertainty that followed him home from battle. She saw the change that began when Ylva was born. She trusted him when he returned from supposed death and asked her to leave everything familiar. Then she spent 15 years beside the man he chose to become. Her understanding of Thors was therefore deeper than admiration. She knew his peace was not natural innocence. It had been built over guilt, fear, and effort. When he struggled to find the right words for Thorfinn, Helga understood what he was trying to say. She knew that her husband's silence did not come from emptiness. Sometimes he carried more than language could easily hold. To Ylva, Thors was the father who worked. She was too young to remember Jarmsborg clearly and had no reason to care about the reputation that amazed the village boys. The useful Thors mattered more than the legendary one. This is why her response to his departure focused on practical consequences. Who would do the work? Who would keep the household secure? Her concern may sound ordinary, but it reflects the life Thors valued most. Ylva also became evidence that his transformation was genuine. The warrior who once felt disappointed that his first child was not a son raised a daughter strong enough to support the family after he was gone. He did not force her into a narrow role or treat her worth as secondary. The household survived because Ylva had been allowed to become fully capable. To Leif, Thors was a friend who believed in the possibility of another world. Leif's stories could sound exaggerated to children and amusing to adults, but Thors listened to the hope within them. After the ambush, Leif turned that friendship into responsibility. He searched for Thorfinn for years, refusing to abandon the son of the man he could not save. Leif's loyalty connects Thors to Vinland in a way that goes beyond geography. Thors never reached the western land, but his trust in Leif helped the idea survive in his family. Without Leif's stories, Thorfinn might not have had a name for the refuge he later sought. Without Leif's persistence, he might never have returned to Iceland at all. To Ari and the young villagers, Thors became the end of their illusions about war. They had left home expecting glory and found themselves helpless in an ambush. Thor's sacrifice allowed them to return. Every ordinary year they lived afterward existed because he chose their lives over his own. Ari eventually became part of Thor's family by marrying Ylva. The eager boy who once imagined proving himself in battle settled into the life Thors had protected. In that quiet outcome, another piece of the sacrifice found meaning. To Floki, Thors was a threat even when he sought no power. This reveals something important about insecure men. Thors did not need to insult Floki directly. His ability, calmness, and reputation were enough. Floki interpreted the difference between them as judgment. He could not imagine that Thors had stopped caring about the competition entirely. By arranging the assassination, Floki tried to erase the person who made him feel smaller. Instead, he enlarged Thor's influence. The killing set Thorfinn's entire journey in motion, brought Askeladd into contact with the idea of a true warrior, and eventually contributed to the dissolution of the Jomsvikings. Floki preserved the legacy he wanted to destroy. To Thorkel, Thors was the greatest opponent and greatest unanswered question. Thorkel understood physical strength better than almost anyone. He knew what it meant to face a man whose speed and power exceeded his own. But Thor's final superiority was something Thorkel could not measure in a duel. Thorkel could lift heavier weapons, endure wounds, and dominate battlefields, yet he remained dependent on war for meaning. Thors walked away from the very thing that gave warriors like Thorkel their identity. The decision made him appear mad, but it also suggested freedom. Thorkel was powerful enough to go almost anywhere, but not powerful enough to imagine a life without fighting. To Askeladd, Thors was proof that another kind of leader could exist. Askeladd had spent his life among men driven by appetite. Gold, revenge, fear, land, and pride made people predictable. Thors confused him because he had the ability to dominate but no desire to do so. When Askeladd asked Thors to lead his band, the question revealed a rare moment of hope. A group of violent men under Thors would still be violent, but perhaps Askeladd briefly imagined that strength and purpose could be united without corruption. Thors' refusal closed that possibility, yet the encounter remained with him. Askeladd did not become a follower of Thors. He continued to raid, manipulate, and kill. Still, the final advice he gave Thorfinn carried Thors' language: become a true warrior, move beyond revenge, travel farther than the small world of hatred. The murderer became one of the messengers through whom the victim's wisdom survived. To Thorfinn, Thors changed many times. First, he was simply father, large, quiet, and dependable. Then he became a secret hero whose old sword and reputation filled a child with wonder. At the ambush, he became an invincible warrior. Moments later, he seemed to become a defeated man who surrendered when victory was in reach. For years afterward, Thorfinn remembered only the wound. His father's death was the event around which everything turned. Thors became a reason to hate. Later in slavery, he became a voice from before the hatred. The words about enemies returned. The idea of a true warrior returned. Thorfinn began to understand that his father had not thrown away victory. He had chosen a different victory, one that the child could not see. Eventually, Thors became a standard Thorfinn could approach but never comfortably claim to have reached. Whenever Thorfinn was tempted to use violence, the memory of his father stood beside the decision, not as a judge demanding perfection, but as a reminder that another path should be searched for first. The series does not present Thors as flawless. That is essential to why he feels human. He once killed without mercy. He initially valued a son more than a daughter. He hid much of his past from his children, leaving Thorfinn unprepared to understand the danger when it arrived. He struggled to explain his beliefs. He still relied on physical force. In the final confrontation, he trusted an agreement with men he knew were dishonest because the alternatives were limited. His philosophy did not save him. That last fact is often used to question whether his choices were wise. Could Thors have killed Askeladd and escaped? Could he have attacked Bjorn before Thorfinn was seized? Could he have refused Floki in Iceland and defended the village? Could a man of his ability have found some route through the crisis that allowed him to live? Perhaps Vinland Saga leaves enough space for those questions. Thors was powerful but not all-knowing. A different decision might have changed the outcome. Yet imagining a perfect tactical escape can distract from the moral reality of the situation. Thors was surrounded by people who made his love into a weakness. Floki threatened the village because Thors cared about it. Bjorn seized Thorfinn because Thors cared about him. Askeladd's archers could force surrender because Thors refused to treat the lives around him as expendable. Any strategy that guaranteed Thors' survival would likely have transferred risk to someone else. He might have won by accepting deaths among the villagers or mercenaries. He chose not to define that result as victory. His death also does not prove that peace was useless. Violence kills violent and peaceful people alike. Thors had survived years of battle partly through skill and partly through fortune. The fact that mercy did not make him immortal says nothing surprising. His belief was never that kindness created a shield around the body. The question was what kind of life remained worth living when safety could not be guaranteed. Thors decided that 15 years as a husband, father, farmer, and neighbor were worth more than a longer life as the Troll of Jom. Askeladd viewed those years as hidden potential. Thors viewed the years of killing as the waste. That reversal challenges the values of the world around him. In a traditional warrior tale, the quiet years would be a pause before the hero returned to his true calling. In Thor's story, war was the false life and peace was the true one. His appearance supports that contrast. As a younger Jomsviking, his face was harder, his hair and beard more controlled, his expression distant. In Iceland, age and a fuller beard gave him a warmer presence. The same enormous frame remained, but it no longer seemed designed only for violence. He could carry a child, lift a beam, row a boat, or warm a dying man. His scarred hands represented both lives. They were capable of killing, and they were capable of work. Thors could not erase what they had done, but he could choose what they did next. This is why his statement about the sword includes an admission of imperfection. He did not claim purity. He knew that abandoning war did not remove war from inside him. When Thorfinn was threatened, anger rose immediately. The old capacity remained. Peace required him to govern it again and again. A lesser version of the character might have become gentle because he lost the ability to fight. Thors is compelling because he remains the strongest person present. His restraint cannot be mistaken for weakness. When he spares someone, the audience knows he had another option. But Vinland Saga also asks us not to admire only the power behind the restraint. If mercy matters only when performed by someone invincible, then ordinary people are excused from it. Thor's real lesson is not that everyone should be able to defeat 30 men without killing them. It is that every person can question the moment when fear tells them another life has become worthless. There is another reason Thors remains so important despite appearing for only a small part of Vinland Saga. He changes the meaning of everything that follows. Without him, Thorfinn's early years could look like a familiar revenge story. A boy loses his father, becomes strong, and pursues the killer. The audience might naturally wait for the moment when the son finally wins. Thor's words make that expectation uncomfortable. We know from the beginning that revenge is not the inheritance he wanted to leave. Every time Thorfinn grows more dangerous, the growth feels like loss. His speed, endurance, and skill resemble his father's, but they carry him in the wrong direction. The question is never simply whether he will become strong enough to defeat Askeladd. It is whether he will understand why Thors did not kill Askeladd when he had the chance. That understanding takes most of a lifetime because Thor's lesson cannot be learned as a slogan. No enemies, no sword, peace. The words are easy to repeat and difficult to live. Thorfinn must experience the emptiness of revenge, the humiliation of slavery, the friendship of someone harmed by war, and the responsibility of leading others before the meaning becomes his own. Thors gives him the destination, but not the road. Perhaps that is the unavoidable limitation of every parent. A father can offer wisdom, but he cannot place his own experience directly inside a child. Thors knew where violence led because he had traveled there. Thorfinn saw only that his father was preventing him from beginning the journey. On the night before the voyage, when Thorfinn accused him of lying, Thors could not produce an explanation strong enough to overcome the boy's excitement. He asked Helga to raise their son well. He seemed to sense that his own words had failed and that he might not return for another attempt. Helga told him she understood. That quiet exchange contains the sorrow of everything ahead. Thors had escaped armies but could not escape time. He had changed, but the world had not changed with him. He wanted to give Thorfinn the wisdom of his scars without giving him the scars themselves. He did not succeed. Still, failure in one moment did not make the lesson disappear. The words waited. They waited while Thorfinn crossed battlefields. They waited while he slept beneath wagons and ate beside men he hated. They waited through every duel with Askeladd. They waited until the young warrior had no enemy left and discovered that he had no self beyond the hatred. Then, when he was finally ready, they returned. In this way, Thor's influence resembles a seed planted in hard ground. For years, nothing appears at the surface. The soil looks empty, then conditions change and something that seemed lost begins to grow. The same can be said of Vinland. Thors never sailed there, never built a house there, and never saw his son stand on its shore. Yet he helped make the journey possible. He gave moral meaning to the place. Without him, Vinland might have remained only an exciting Western country. Because of him, it became somewhere people could imagine living without chains. The dream was larger than any single settlement. Even when conflict forced Thorfinn to leave, the principle remained. Somewhere beyond the world people accept as inevitable, another way of living may be attempted. Thors himself had already created a small version of that place in Iceland. It was imperfect and vulnerable, but for 15 years his home was free from the identity others chose for him. He woke without waiting for a command. He raised children without preparing them to kill for a chief. He worked beside neighbors rather than ruling soldiers. He proved that the Troll of Jarm was not the only person he could be. This may be the most personal form of freedom in Vinland Saga. Thors had been given a name by other men: troll, captain, warrior, deserter. Each name tried to define what he was permitted to become. By leaving, he claimed the right to change. The Jarmsvikings treated desertion as betrayal because institutions built around violence cannot easily tolerate someone who walks away. The deserter does more than remove one fighter. He suggests that the values holding everyone else in place are choices rather than laws of nature. Thor's existence was dangerous to Jarmsborg for that reason. If its greatest warrior could decide that glory was empty, what did that say about the men who remained? Floki's hatred grew from more than jealousy. Thor's peaceful life was an accusation, even though Thors never intended it as one. Thorkel responded with curiosity instead of resentment. He wanted to understand. Floki wanted to silence. Askeladd wanted, for one brief moment, to follow. Thorfinn needed years before he could continue the path. Each response reveals the person who gives it. The title Troll of Jarm therefore carries an irony. It sounds like the name of Thor's truest self, but it is actually the shell he abandoned. The title belongs to how frightened soldiers saw him, not to how he understood himself. The man beneath it was revealed only after he stopped trying to live up to it. When he stood before Askeladd's crew, he used every ability associated with the troll. He moved with overwhelming speed and power, but by sparing the men, he emptied the title of its old meaning. The mercenaries saw the legend and something beyond the legend at the same time. His final victory over Askeladd was complete in the physical sense. He controlled the duel from beginning to end, yet he refused the act that would normally confirm victory. He would not kill the defeated man. Then, when Thorfinn was seized, Thors accepted a physical defeat in order to preserve a moral choice. The arrows killed him, but they did not force him to kill. The mercenaries controlled what happened to his body. They did not control the person he chose to be. This does not make the scene painless or turn death into something desirable. Thors wanted to live. He wanted to return to Helga and Ylva. He wanted to raise Thorfinn. His sacrifice matters precisely because life mattered to him. A man eager for a glorious death would not have made the same choice. Thors gave up something he loved, not something he had grown tired of. He also died with unfinished work. His son misunderstood him. His family needed him. The world remained violent. There was no final proof that his beliefs would succeed. Real lives often end that way. Meaning is carried by those who remain. Helga carried it through patience. Ylva carried it through labor. Leif carried it through loyalty. Ari carried it into the family he built. Askeladd carried it in a phrase offered at the edge of death. Thorkel carried it as a question. Thorfinn carried it first as pain, then as purpose. Even Floki carried it unwillingly, because his fear of Thors shaped decisions that eventually destroyed the power he tried to protect. The life of Thors can therefore be divided into two legacies. One was the legacy he earned deliberately as a warrior. Men remembered his victories, his strength, and the name Troll of Jarm. The other was the legacy he created after rejecting all of that. It was quieter, slower, and far more powerful. The first legacy inspired fear. The second inspired change. When people debate who the strongest character in Vinland Saga might be, Thors is always near the center of the conversation. His fight with Askeladd, his victory over Thorkel, and his ability to defeat so many men without killing them place him above nearly every other warrior we see. But the story uses that question to guide us toward another one. What is strength for? If it exists only to overcome weaker people, then it creates a world in which everyone waits for someone stronger. No victory can be final. Children inherit the grudges of their parents. Kings gather armies because other kings gather armies. Men carry weapons because they assume every stranger may be an enemy. Thors did not lose faith in strength. He changed its purpose. Strength became the ability to protect without possessing, to endure insult without needing revenge, to surrender status, and to choose responsibility over pride. That definition is harder because it offers fewer moments of visible triumph. A battlefield has a clear ending. One side remains standing. The work of peace has no final victory. It must be chosen again each day. Thors chose it while repairing boats. He chose it when buying the slave from Halfdan. He chose it when refusing to celebrate his past. He chose it when agreeing to leave with Floki rather than endanger the village. He chose it when he threw an oar to a drowning enemy. He chose it when he spared Askeladd. He chose it one final time when he placed Thorfinn's life above his own. Seen this way, his story is not simply the tale of a warrior who became a pacifist. It is the story of a man learning that every human life has a weight his old world taught him to ignore. Ylva's birth opened that understanding. The slave's death deepened it. Thorfinn's danger completed it. The child who first made Thors question killing grew into a woman who kept his home alive. The child he died to save became a man who tried to create a country without war. Neither outcome was guaranteed. Both grew from choices made by a father who never lived to see them. And so, at the end of Thors Snorresson's story, we return to the sea. The sea had carried him into battle and away from it. It separated Jomsborg from Iceland, Iceland from the Faroe Islands, and the Old World from Vinland. To the people of the north, it was road, boundary, livelihood, and grave. As a young warrior, Thors disappeared beneath its surface and allowed the world to believe he was dead. He reached land and began again. 15 years later, he died above the water on a ship trapped between cliffs. This time there was no hidden escape. But another part of him crossed the sea. It traveled with Thorfinn through every country, every field, and every battle. It returned to Iceland. It entered Jomsborg and ended the brotherhood Thors had fled. It crossed the Atlantic and stood in Vinland beneath an open sky. The troll of Jom did not make that journey. A father did. A man who had once believed his value came from defeating others, learned that his greatest responsibility was to protect their right to live. He could not create a world without violence by himself. He could not spare his children from every wound. He could not reach the peaceful land he imagined. What he could do was turn away from the path he had been given. He could refuse to pass its hatred forward willingly. He could leave behind words that would take years to bloom. You have no enemies. No one has any enemies. There is no one you need to hurt. Thors spoke those words to a child who did not believe him. The world seemed determined to prove him wrong. Armed men arrived, promises were broken, arrows flew. His son spent years living for revenge. Yet the story did not end at the ambush. The child survived, the words survived, the dream survived. And long after the warriors who feared the troll of Jom had disappeared, the quiet life Thors chose continued to shape the future.